Welcome to Hood Champion Boxing and Sports. In boxing, you find a way to win or you find a way to lose. Dana Whyte is back at it. Thinks fighters are overpaid in boxing. He thinks everything's a going out of business sale whenever they have a major event. But he's entitled to that opinion. That's because he's under fire, man. His guys want to get paid more money. They're not understanding the business model in boxing. They're not understanding the business model in MMA and the UFC in particular. They just don't get it. They don't understand how come they can't make, especially the elite fighters, at least $1 million. And not the Conor McGregor's, who's just, a star. But he's still not making what he really deserves, in a lot of people's opinion. But when you look at Francis Ngannou and Usman, they want to come over to boxing, right? That's because of the payday. So, yeah, maybe they want to prove that they're tougher than Canelo, and Usman wants to prove he's tougher than Canelo, and Ngannou wants to prove he's tougher than the heavyweights. That's kind of part of it. But the primary reason is they want to get paid handsomely, okay? And in my opinion, if they come over to boxing, that could be their going out of business sale. Go out there and make 10, 15 million, and they could be done because they'll probably take them a long time to make that kind of money in the UFC. A lot of fighting, a lot of damage. Come over to boxing. Conor McGregor said it the best in regards to the MMA world, and boxing is half a fight and make 20 times as much money for one fight. So why not do it? But when you look at boxing, particularly like Showtime, right? Because Espinosa is going back and forth with Dana White. They obviously don't really care for each other. But you look at the amount of the events that like Showtime puts on in a year. They'll roll out like a 6-month schedule up front, plan 40 different events, but like 12, 24, maybe 24 to 30 live events for the year. Okay, could be a little more, but on those undercards. On those fight cards, maybe, 4, 5 fights. Some other fight cards they have, maybe 2 fights, maybe none. Okay? So when you look at that, so like 30 fights a year maybe, an average of maybe 3 fights total, 2 undercard, 1 main event, 33 is 90. But 90 fights a year, and they're paying these guys pretty decent money, okay? But you come over and look at like the UFC, and it's hard for them to do it because they just have 720, 750, something like that, like 700 plus active fighters, and they said that they have to give their fighters 3 fights a year. That's a lot of fights to have 700 plus fighters and to try to give them 3 fights a year. That's in order to do that, they got to be putting on like over 1,000, almost 1,100. Like fights a year so that they can give each of their guys on their active roster like 3 fights, and they have yet to even come close to giving 1,000 live events per year, the UFC. So that means some of their fighters aren't getting paid or aren't fighting, but maybe once or maybe not fighting at all. That's a huge commitment. So now this is what Dana White threw out there to the world in an interview. And when you look at that, 1,000 events per year, opposed to 30 to 40, 3 or so fights on a card for the boxing, UFC, 12, 13. Over and over again. So I don't think it's possible for the UFC, that 12 to 13, let's say 10, let's just say 10 fights on every card, 1,000 different live events, right? And it's almost impossible for them to pay guys that kind of money, man, because it's so many events. And then you have the overhead, the way they have it structured, from facilities and training and everything else, because everything is controlled under the UFC. When they went under that reorganization where the UFC was bought out for like $4 billion, that's debt and equity together, right? They decided when it comes to sponsors, like you see all kind of sponsors when back in the day when this whole UFC thing first started with Condom Depot and Trojan and just all kind of different sponsors. And then they started having some other, there's like the Tap Outs and some of these other brands that were coming online. And the UFC decided that they were going to distance themselves with a lot of these different sponsors who, in some cases, were getting free advertisement. And that hurt. And then other time they were paying their fighters. Their fighters were getting paid to wear the logos on their shorts. UFC did all that because they felt like if there's going to be a type of sponsorship associated with the UFC, because there was like a lot of customer confusion where the UFC had its brand, had its product line, then there were other very similar product lines out there, and people were supporting them solely because they were feeling that was associated with the UFC or a UFC product when it wasn't. So the UFC felt like a lot of the sales were going in other areas that really should have been, staying at home with the UFC brand. And as a result, they said, you know what, we're not dealing with any of these sponsors anymore who are eating off of us unfairly, because of course they're not getting a piece of that. So they got it under control where they only dealing with guys who can afford to pay an exclusivity fee, which means let's say I'm on the UFC, I'm signed with the UFC. They'll have to pay the UFC a certain percentage in order for me to sponsor their products and to wear the logo on my shorts. So basically, the UFC wants to get their cut, and they want that because they want consistency. They want to get paid, and then after that, they're like, okay, it felt like that would weed out those small mom and pops, kind of businesses who are just trying to catch their big break off the UFC's name. So that's where you'll see like a Reebok and Under Armour or whatever these big names, I know Reebok was one for sure, who are heavily associated with them. But in doing so, you got these different TV networks, like in particular ESPN. That makes it easier for them to maintain their relationship with ESPN because the whole world knows Reebok. It's a reputable brand. There's huge money behind them. They've been around for a while. But when you get these condom depots and stuff like that, that's not really something that ESPN wants to keep flashing on their screen during commercials. So it makes sense when you think about the UFC deciding to kind of weed out some of those more or less miscellaneous brands and businesses that are just kind of leeching off of their name, the UFC's name and brand. But as a result, it has hurt a lot of the fighters who were getting a couple thousand here and there, because now the larger brands aren't really paying them any attention, and they're missing those opportunities. But as far as the UFC and boxing, pay-per-view, right? We talk about pay-per-view. And Dana White's saying that boxers are paid too much money. And this is the thing. This isn't something that just started happening. There's a reason why boxing generates so much money. I think the whole world really enjoys it's combat sports, but boxing has just been around for a while and it's not going nowhere. Now, I will say some of the fights that people want to see, it happens more in the MMA world because they have that control. Dana White has that control over there. He decides who does what. He has this pay model pay structure, and this whole thing, how salary is determined. And according to Dana White, he makes sure even the least known fighters are able to make a decent enough salary to where they can sustain themselves and their family. Whereas in boxing, you have guys who aren't really known, but they're these professional boxers, and they make nothing. Now, I don't know how true that is, but I do know the stories of some of these boxers, come out there and they just get nickel and dimed. And, that happens. But you got to make a name for yourself. You got to win fights. And then there's the marketing piece. Now, I can't drill down to all the specifics on all of that. But my thing is, I think there's a little bit of truth to that about kind of lower tiered fighters not really making good money. That's just when they're first starting off. But as these guys start to get ranked and really start to make a name for themselves, the salaries increase. Okay, and that's not something that's not false. That's true. The salaries start to pick up. Purses get bigger. And if they continue, they get the big fights. Purses double, triple, or times 10. That's kind of how it works in boxing. In Mayweather, not quite that way. But as far as boxers being overpaid, well, if Dana White's going to say that, then we got to take a look at fighters from the past. Like Muhammad Ali, and we're talking about George Foreman and the type of money these guys were generating back then. And if you look at that and consider all of that with inflation, right? With inflation. So if those fights that happened then were actually happening present time, then fighters have been getting overpaid for a long time. Because like the Muhammad Ali and George Foreman, okay? This is what's so crazy about it. They, with inflation, would have made $510 million for their pay-per-view event. $510 million for their pay-per-view event. That's what Ali versus Foreman would have made. Isn't that crazy? Then you look at Floyd Mayweather and Manny Pacquiao in 2015. Now we're talking about with inflation, what they would have made is $500 million. That's the pay-per-view event. And then Floyd Mayweather, Conor McGregor, that happened in 2017. The $500 million is what the event generated. Then Muhammad Ali, Joe Frazier, too, generated $500 million. That's in 1975. But no, we're talking about with inflation. That's where they would have been. So you look at those numbers, it's pretty much the same as far as the type of the revenue generated. So there's something there with boxing that maybe the UFC can look at and maybe be more selective about who they sign. I mean, these guys have fighters signed from like 71 different countries. And, I think sometimes they say like your eyes are bigger than your belly. You know what I'm saying? And I think for these guys, sometimes maybe their eyes are bigger than their pockets. There's so much talent out there. But you can't really compare the UFC to the NFL, to Major League Baseball. These leagues have been around for years. But to become part of the NBA, become part of the NFL, become part of Major League Baseball, they're taking like the top 1%, if that, man. There's only a limited number of people that can get into those professional leagues, man. So maybe Dana White needs to stop and take a look at what he's doing and kind of scale back on how many people he takes on his roster. Because, 700 and something fighters, and you promise them 3 fights a year, and you're only giving half the events that's really necessary to ensure those fighters get their 3 fights a year. That means if they're making, I don't know, let's say one guy's making $10,000 a fight, and he's planning on $30,000 a year because you say 3 times and he only gets once. That's $10,000 for the year. That's where you see situations like a couple of these females. I can't remember the names, but I read the articles where Jake Paul gave a girl money to cover her training expenses and a little money in her pocket so she could sustain herself because she won the fight, got fight of the night or knockout of the night or something. And after she went back, she was so glad because with that little extra money, she had a little money to pay her rent. But without that, she would have just broke even based on training and everything else. But these guys aren't getting the fights, enough fights. And then when you're taking the sponsorship thing away from them, that hurts as well. Because there's some of these up and coming brands and businesses who maybe want to grow with a fighter they feel has potential. So they want to invest solely in that fighter, but they can only give them like $3,000-4,000 a fight. But Dana White's like, no, we were not messing with you guys. Reebok, Nike, Under Armour, Red Bull, whatever, man. All these big names. Those are the guys we're messing with because we know you can afford to give us 20, 30, 50,000, 100,000. And then, you pay our guy, you pay your guy, I don't know, a couple thousand for the fight. No problem. But that's why the UFC and Dana White, these guys are making so much money because the amount, the large piece of that promotional money is going to the UFC. And I understand what Dana White is saying. I get it. If it wasn't for us, this wouldn't be enabled. It wouldn't be allowed. It wouldn't be happening. So give us our cut. And I get it. But I don't think that's right. But if you're talking about the pay-per-view model and guys being overpaid, you got to look at Mike Tyson. And even back when, he fought like Evander Holyfield, the second fight, with inflation, those pay-per-view events generate over $281 million. So De La Hoya, Floyd Mayweather, it's over $200 million. So when you look at it, boxing works. But you got to get to a certain level. And with him talking about boxers are overpaid, maybe Dana White needs to take a look at his business model and his roster and maybe streamline that a bit. Now, I don't have all the history on the MMA, UFC, their pay structure and everything. I just looked at I read a few articles and I've been kind of following it on and off because it's such a big topic with the pay. And I look over there at fighters. Now, I can easily go in there and pull up a couple recent pay-per-view events and see the salaries on the fighters on the other card, those who are actually be on the undercard itself, and then those fights that aren't going to be on TV. And look at what guys are getting paid. But if someone is 1 or 2 fights in, he gets $3,000, $4,000, that's okay. You're cutting your teeth now. But as they start to bubble up, like a good example, I'm not even going to use Nico Ali Wash. I'm not even going to use Evander Holyfield's son. Okay? But you look at guys like, let's say, the Montana Love guy, right? When he was coming up, we really didn't hear much about him, but he wasn't getting paid huge money. But he was winning. He was winning. People start paying attention. Now he's over there with Eddie Hearn. But if you go back and look at the kind of money he was making the first 5 fights, it's not like what he's making now, but you have to win. So that's almost, to me, with fighters, and I think it's going to be for both the MMA world and the boxing world, it's like a probation period, and that probationary period could be your first 10 fights or so to see if there's some promise there. And after that, then it's like, okay, now he gets his vacation time. Now we're going to give him the bonus. Now he's going to get the increase in salary. You see what I'm saying? Because you're going to become a permanent part of that company. But if you can't get through the probation period, they're like, okay, we're glad we didn't invest too heavily in that person. But nevertheless, I think everybody should be paid fairly, especially guys who have families, man. It sucks. But Dana White is just feeling that pressure. And for him to come out and tell his guys just to forget about it, forget about boxing, leave those guys alone, that's because Dana White is getting that pressure over there. And remember, those guys just went to court about a lot of this stuff a couple of years ago. And, I don't think he wants to get back into that. I think he just wants to leave it alone. And he just wants his guys to comply and listen to him because he has the keys to the kingdom. But he is frustrated, and he should feel some pressure because at least have a conversation with your guys. Sit down. That's what I would do. I'd put out, he doesn't want to disclose too much because the guys on his team who are underneath him, they don't need to know about what's happening there at that strategic level. They don't need to know. But when you have an uproar like this, you have to contain it. And the number one way to contain that is through educating. And that's done through communication. There needs to be some kind of communication with those guys so they can understand, well, this is the situation. And if it's not going to change, then you need to just, still have that conversation to birth understanding. And they don't have to agree with you. This is the thing, right? In life, I don't have to agree with you. If I can understand what you're doing, that makes all the difference in the world. But I don't have to agree, but I understand. You see, and if you can reach that, if Dana White can reach that with his fighters, I think he'll be in a much better space. Doesn't mean it's going to totally eliminate these guys calling out boxers. But right now, I'm not sure his majority of the guys over there really understand what the hell is going on and why they can't make the kind of money that boxers do. But there's a lot of articles out there that you guys can go and read and get spun up on just like I did. But it's a lot of fighters, man, 700-something fighters, trying to give them 3 fights a year, put on over 1,000 events with, 10 to 14 fights on that card. It's a lot of, they make a lot of money, man. They're a huge pay-per-view success. But they can take some of that pay-per-view money and shell it out to their guys. I mean, if you look at, like I said, Mayweather and Pacquiao generating $500 million. Some of those UFC fights sell $1 million. We know Mayweather and Pacquiao is the exception, but if these UFC fights are selling over $1 million in pay-per-view consistently and throughout the year, so you figure it's like $100 million. Let's say $50 million in pay-per-view every event. Over, have 1,000 events, let's say 500 events. It's a lot of damn money. And you tell me you can't pay your guys $1 million, at least a heavyweight champion, at least $1 million? And I understand when you look at the cost and you start to do debiting, and just saying, hey, this needs to come out, this is that, these are my expenses, this is what we have. And when you create that balance sheet and you come down and look at, this is what remains. I get it, but you can't, I still just, with the numbers they're putting out, the pay-per-view sales they have, with everything else, merchandise, I can't understand how this guy is saying, even with that large roster, that you can't give your big dogs over there, especially the champions, $10 million paydays, $5 million paydays. Like, it doesn't add up. Even if they do something at the end of the year, come up with a bonus or something for the champion, like they have to work something out. Now, he has all these different clauses in there about when you're a champion. If you're an attraction, you get a certain part of pay-per-view sales. So they have everything in there, but, increase the percentages. Like, figure something out, because I'm going to tell you, Francis Ngannou shouldn't have made $650,000 for his last fight. Francis Ngannou should be making, in my opinion, it's just my opinion, at least $5-10 million. But at least get him at $1 million. You can't get him at $1 million, man. $2-3 million. And he's the heavyweight champion of the UFC and a very dominant one. So I don't know. But then again, like I said, I'd like to be a fly on the wall to hear those conversations and understand. But UFC is not going anywhere. Just like the issues with fighter pay is not going anywhere. But when you start looking at Frank Bruno and Mike Tyson, back in 1996, with inflation, they would have made $160 million. If that fight was happening today. So, just a lot of money out there. Over 100 million, man. 100 million. Matter of fact, all the pay-per-view events that sold really well in boxing, they grossed $100 million to $500 million. That's crazy for one event. 100 million to 500 million. So when you're selling, 1 million plus pay-per-view, not 1 million plus pay-per-view sales, you're pocketing at least $100 million. And it just doesn't make any sense to me that you can't figure, you can't pay your guys, at least your big dogs, at least $10 million. In boxing, they're getting it right. and it is what it is. But leave your comments below. Like I said, I'm no expert on all this. It's just something that I looked at to try to get spun up on, and I just don't see the reason why those UFC fighters can't get paid more money. When you look at it, they're putting out huge pay-per-view numbers, just like what Ali and Foreman were doing back in the day. What about what Canelo does right now? You know, Pacquiao and Floyd was the exception. Pacquiao and McGregor was the exception. That's why they're almost $600 million in pay-per-view sales. So that's why Floyd was able to make $100 million. Pacquiao was able to make, I don't know, $40 million or something, because they made almost $600 million. So to think about what Showtime took home, you know? So got to be a proper balance. And that's the issue with the UFC. I don't think they had a proper balance. But anyway, man, like and subscribe. Leave your comments below. I'm sure I'll probably get some guys from the MMA world to chime in. Hey, man, if you're smarter than me, break it down, because I just think all these guys, if you're getting punched in the face, you should get paid. But you're getting kicked, choked, kneed, elbowed, headbutt. Pay those guys, because the type of damage they're taking, unless they can get somebody out there real quick. But if they're just in there like them Diaz, like Nate Diaz, I hate to see him when he gets 50, 55 years old, what he's going to be like, what his faculties, if they're still going to be intact. I just hate to see it, because he takes a lot of damage, but people love him. He, at minimum, he's one of those guys should be making $10 million a fight, $15 million. He deserves it. He's a fan favorite. He's a draw. He's been doing it for a while. He's been grinding it out. At least reward him. But anyway, man, y'all keep cool. Thanks for the support. Like and subscribe. Shout out to all the veterans. And I'm in the breeze.